All right, well, thank you all so much for everything so far this conference. It's been really productive for me. I'm really excited to get to share this work. And I'm excited to be on a panel with a geographer, given that this project has made me think much more deeply about the nature of space. And I'm really interested in getting as much feedback as I can on this topic. So my paper used Joseph Bean's spiritual diary that you see right here to recreate the spiritual map of his tailor's shop. Bean was an ordinary tailor living and working in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1740s. And following his religious awakening at the hands of George Whitefield in 1740, Bean's tailor shop became a place to work out the temporal implications of his new birth and answer a core question that animated the rest of his life. How should one live and work as a newly awakened Christian? He tried desperately to infuse his work with religious meaning and tried to discipline his senses in order to trigger the right types of religious experiences. His use of the sensorial cues that he found in his workplace enables us to create a spiritual map of his workplace that charts the distinctive religious experiences he had in the three distinct areas of his workplace. On the shop floor, which was marked by movement and light, he meditated on the contrast between the fleeting nature of human things and the permanence of divine things. In his cellar, where he performed hard physical labor in the dark away from the prying eyes of others, he experienced religious visions and divine manifestations. In his shop chamber, a semi-private space marked by his ghostly awareness of the activity on the shop floor, Bean completed his religious devotions. And I'm not going to talk about his shop chamber for time's sake today, but I'm happy to talk more about it later. Bean tried to discipline his senses to provoke the right types of religious experiences, attempted but usually failed to speak with his coworkers and customers about religion, and struggled to make his daily labor an act of constant worship. But these efforts were exhausting, and when his business began to struggle in the winter of 1743, Bean decided to quit his life as a tailor and become a minister. He concluded that it was not possible to work as a Christian tailor. And this is spiritual diary where he tracks the state of his soul. And you can see that pretty much every space on the page is used up with his sort of constant searching and watching, as he called it. He has no time for punctuation, no spaces. It's just sort of a stream of consciousness style of diary. And spiritual diaries can be incredibly frustrating to work with because they often pay no attention to sort of the temporal realities around a person, right? He never actually mentions a name in this diary, and it's taken me 3 years of working with it to be able to say with some confidence that he was a tailor. But nonetheless, this vivid portrait of his workplace emerges from this source, which I think speaks to its significance in his life. So on a shop floor, Bean contrasted the transience of human exchanges with the permanence of the divine. And here we see an example of a contemporary tailor shop, and you'll note that it's marked by two things, right? It's really crowded and it's very light. Tailors sat on shop boards under windows so that they had access to the best light. Here we have another example of a contemporary tailor shop where I think you get a better sense of the sort of major spiritual challenges he would have faced as he worked on the shop floor. First, the tailors socialized while they worked. You can see that many of them are drinking alcohol, and you can imagine that these conversations in these male-dominated spaces could get raunchy and rowdy. And for someone who's sort of constantly trying to control their sensory inputs, this was very dangerous. Second, you see that the young man in the front is working with what looks like a very sort of luxurious and beautiful piece of fabric. Bean remembered how before his conversion, the physical sensations provoked by, quote, good garments and other finery had stolen my heart from God. Our conversation yesterday about the role of memory and sensation was really helpful for me because Bean is constantly contrasting the sensations he had before he became a Christian and those after. Third, Bean worried that his tailoring skills enabled him to make clothes that could misportray who a person was, allowing that person to dress above their station and mask their ugly and unchristian interior with foppish finery, right? As part of a broader 18th century obsession about the relationship between the interior and exterior, and coming out of these revivals especially, this fear that someone was acting like a Christian but wasn't really a Christian, and being really worried about the way that his profession could contribute to this. And you can see from this great image, you have a tailor who's probably dressed a little bit too fancily for the job he is doing. fitting a woman for stays in a very intimate way. And I think that this image is probably one of Joseph Bean's biggest fears. So to protect himself from such snares, he attempted to use the sensorial cues of his shop floor to train himself so that his sensations at work provoked the right types of religious experience. His shop floor had 2 windows on opposite walls, a door, and a fireplace. The windows and doors opened out onto the streets of Cambridge, enabling him to see and to listen to the events on the street. They also enabled people and things to enter and leave his shop, reminding him of the transience of the business he conducted on his shop floor. One July day in 1741, for example, quote, "A little bird flew into my shop window and immediately out of the other window." The sight of the birds darting in and out of the shop caused Bean to, quote, "See how frail I be, that is but coming into the world and then a going out of it as fast as I can." He prayed that God would, quote, "Let everything I see or feel or taste or smell throughout my life serve to raise my thoughts above all second causes unto the first and final cause of all things." So this movement in and out of his shop really emphasizes to Bean that he himself will eventually move on into the next world. The fireplace, meanwhile, in his shop served as a sensory reminder of the realities of eternal damnation. On busy days, he would look into the fireplace every 30 minutes and see, quote, "the everlasting flames of hell." The heat emanating from the fire likely caused Bean to remember times in the past when he felt his skin burn by an errant ember, his tailoring iron that you actually see in this furnace in this image, or the dripping wax of the candle that illuminated his writing. He conjured these memories to reflect, quote, "on how intolerable and beyond measure painful would be for to scorch upon this fire for 1,000 years. The fireplace reminded him of the eternal stakes of the choices he made on his shop floor. And this use of fire as a sort of way to see if you could withstand the rigors of hell is actually pretty common in this period. So while Bean's experiences on his shop floor were shaped by light, movement, and interactions with others, his shop had a second place, a cellar, where he could enjoy the privacy and darkness that led to rapturous communion with God. The privacy enabled him to act freely on his religious impulses without worrying that he was performing for others, while the darkness stopped him from focusing on his physical surroundings in a way that heightened his spiritual senses. Now, this is a still life of a drunk passed out in a cellar, but I think it's actually an appropriate image for understanding Bean's cellar experiences for a couple reasons. First, you see the stairwell leading up into a different space, and Bean always remarked on his descent into the cellar as a particularly significant moment, right? There's an atmospheric shift from the light and movement of the shop floor to the cooler, damper, darker cellar. And so that was a spiritually significant moment for him. Second, I'm pretty sure the labor he's doing in the cellar has something to do with distilling, although I'm still trying to sort that out. So the alcohol theme of this image is useful in that sense. And third, the intense labor that Bean did in his cellar often caused him to pass out, which is sort of enabling some of these religious visions. So I think we should just imagine that this man is not passed out from alcohol, but because he is being transported into heaven. So on one such occasion, Bean was, quote, "down the cellar about some business when he had much of the presence of God with me. Oh, most happy communion with him. Oh, how wonderfully affected with the everlasting love of God." This communion enabled him to have, quote, "such blessed sights of Christ by faith." And notice that Bean really is careful in distinguishing the physical sensation of sight from the spiritual sight that is enabling him to see God, right? This is a product of the religious culture that he's currently living in. The embodied Jesus Christ is not in the cellar with Bean. Instead, Bean, quote, "cast an eye of faith to see the immaculate Lamb of God hanging upon the cursed tree and his arms widely extended." This eye of faith enables Bean to see Christ's body splayed on the cross and understand the world-shaping significance of that act. And while the fireplace on his shop floor enabled Bean to see hell, his cellar vision enabled him to experience a fraction of the grace of Christ's crucifixion. Despite Bean's efforts to transform his workplace into a site of awakened piety, he ultimately concluded that it was not possible for him to work as a Christian tailor. He therefore left his career as a tailor behind and became a minister. And here you can see a contrast, right? Both tailoring and ministering are really hard on your eyes. And this diary that I showed you before, he kept in his early 20s. And you can see how his eyesight deteriorates, right? I've never actually really seen handwriting this big that you see on the left in the surviving sermon that he preached toward the end of his life. It's a pretty remarkable document. So what are the lessons of Joseph Bean has for those of us interested in the relationship between capitalism and the senses? I think there's three things. First, Bean's workplace, a tailor shop, was one of the most common workplaces in early America. Tailors were the largest groups of artisans and made almost all of the clothing worn by all members of colonial society. The textile trade was big business in the 18th century, and it fell to tailors like Bean to translate the textiles imported from all over the globe into the clothes that men and women wore as they went about their daily lives. The spiritual challenges that he faced about how to work as a Christian in a rapidly shifting economic environment were therefore fairly common ones. Second, religion played a key role in how Bean interpreted his sensory experiences, right? Religion is not confined to churches and meeting houses that are dotting the New England landscape, but coming with him into his shop, right? Everything is sort of filtered through that lens. And third, Bean's failures to work as a Christian tailor point to a major transformation that occurred within Christianity over the course of the 18th and 19th century. That laid the foundation, I think, for the Christian capitalism that is such a basic part of the American consumer experience. At the end of my paper, I sort of referenced this image, which I think is such a great image for our conference, right, from the Quaker Library in central London. Be still and cool in thine own mind, a Quaker prayer to mark where the refrigerated goods are in a bustling cafe. I think once Bean got over the wonders of modern refrigeration, he would have been shocked by the idea that you could have a Christian cafe, a Christian sandwich store, or a Christian craft store. And it's this transformation that my broader book project is currently trying to explain. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of our conversation.